Yeah.
Okay. Hi, it's Danny Lozano with the Brunette Edit podcast.
Hi, I'm back for episode 4 of the Brunette Edit. Thank you for joining me today. So I am going to be deep diving my almost life-ending experience with COVID. And it's been almost 5 years since this event, but it was definitely life-changing for me. And the reason why I felt like it was important to record this was because of just a lot of things going on in the world right now, where we're kind of living in a world where people are not, in my opinion, thinking logically about science and healthcare and vaccines specifically. And it's disheartening, especially for somebody like me who does have to have vaccines so that I don't get sick. And you'll understand why as I go through my story. But I think that right now the world is a little bit crazy, and it's scary to see what the future holds for people who not only need vaccines, but for people who require mental health care, for parents that have children with disabilities, especially parents that are getting IEPs, support through regional centers, care through the state for, their children or loved ones. And it's disheartening to me that this is or seems to be the trajectory of the world, especially here in the United States. And it's daunting, to be honest. So I felt like it was a really good time to kind of remind people of what it was like when we went through COVID and what the experience was for somebody who almost lost their life to COVID. So if you go back to 2020, I remember it distinctly. And I'm going to go as far back as March 2020 because I remember the last day that I was in an office working, which was March 17th. It was St. Patrick's Day. Coincidentally enough, it was me and my best friends who were kind of the last people standing in our office. And it was really weird to see. It really felt very like The Walking Dead. And we all went home. And I have not worked in an office since 2020. So the world definitely changed in a lot of ways. And the isolation that we went through, I went stir crazy. And when they lifted the restrictions every so often, I definitely spread my wings. And it was quite frustrating for my family because they were like, well, if you bring COVID home, getting very upset with me. And it's like, I don't think because we've ever gone through something like this, we took it seriously. But at the same time, when we were giving free rope after being isolated for weeks and weeks, it was like, yeah, I'm going to go to the ice cream shop with my niece. I'm going to go see my friends and my cousins. I've been in a jail cell for 3 months. So it was June 2020, and they had lifted some of the restrictions for COVID. We weren't in complete lockdown, and I was able to meet up with my cousin. I had gotten my eyebrows microbladed by my cousin, and I was with her for about 3 or 4 hours, and we kind of just said our goodbyes. And I want to say it was like the next day I saw my other cousin with her daughter because I took my niece, and we got together. We had a play date at her house, and then I took my little niece to get ice cream with my sister. So I saw quite a few people within 2 days. I don't think I was exposed to many people in public, but I guess I was because it wasn't maybe 2 days later that I was working and I got a really bad headache, and it was like a headache that was at the base of my skull in the back of my neck, and I just felt so exhausted. I logged out of work 5 o'clock and I crawled right into bed, and I thought I must just have a really bad headache. Maybe I'm getting, the flu or a cold or something. I don't know. I just felt so fatigued. And so I went to bed at 5:30. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning, and I had a fever. And I knew I had a fever without even taking my temperature because my body had never felt like this before. My whole back side of my body felt like it was just overheated. Like I just felt like I was hot. And I just didn't feel good. I can't explain physically what it felt like. I just did not feel well. My head was pounding, and I think I ended up taking my temperature, and it was like 104, I want to say. It was something like astronomical that I had never seen before. And at that point, you could only get COVID tests in the emergency rooms or COVID site, like designated COVID testing sites. And so I went directly into the ER and I told him, I think I have COVID, had my little mask on, and, they had you in two lines. One was for COVID patients and one was for not COVID patients. And so as soon as I got to the front desk, the clerk is giving me like papers to sign. And I just look at him and I'm like, I told him I'm going to vomit. And so he handed me this cardboard bowl, and in one hand I'm vomiting, and in the other hand he's still making me sign my check-in papers. And there was a guy I'd gone to high school with who was right behind me, and I was just mortified. I'm just thinking, God, I hope he doesn't recognize me because this is mortifying. I'm vomiting at the front desk of the emergency room, which obviously people are there because it's an emergency, but I've never been sick like that. And so it was just a lot going on at once. So they called me back and they put me in a little like cove room with a door. And I just told the nurse, can I lay down? Like, I really just don't feel well, because they had sat me down in a chair next to the bed. And so I asked the nurse, like, can I lay down? She's like, yes, that's fine. Like, the doctor will be in. They're going to take an x-ray. So I guess the first thing that they were doing was taking x-rays just based on I had symptoms of COVID. Then they did a COVID test. Well, I don't know if it was before or after the x-ray, but they did a COVID test as well. They told me it would take up to 3 days for the results to come back, but they were going to do x-rays. So they did the x-rays in the room. Like, they were not exposing me to any other areas of the hospital. And I waited for the doctor to come in. The doctor came in and said, you have a pneumonia in your left lung. And he pulled up the x-ray on the little light thing, and my whole left lung was white. And so he said, you have quite a lot of fluid. I didn't feel the fluid. I didn't know I had a pneumonia, which is so strange because I have asthma. So usually I would feel any kind of respiratory distress. I mean, even mild asthma. I did not know I had pneumonia. So he immediately gave me the antibiotics for COVID. I don't remember what they're called, but they sent me on my way, told me to rest and do all that. And so on the way home, they called me and they said, your COVID test came back positive. And so I'm freaking out because I don't live alone. And now I'm going to expose my family to COVID. And this is when people are treating COVID like the plague. So I called my mom and I said, like, I have COVID. I was crying because, I was scared. I didn't want to expose her. And then my brother calls me. He's like, you have COVID? And I'm like, yes. And I'm like crying. And he's like, well, what are you going to do? And I was like, what do you mean what I'm going to do? I'm going to isolate. Well, he's like, well, you can't go home. And I'm like, well, I don't have anywhere to isolate. He's all, well, we can get you a hotel room. But I'm like, you can't give me a hotel room because they're testing people before they check into hotels. So that wasn't even an option. Meanwhile, my brother has a condo and like, he's not even like, hey, come isolate here. But ultimately, the decision was made that I'm going to isolate at home, and that's just what it's going to be. So the doctors had told me, just the normal care. The best that they knew at the time was just to treat it like the flu and care for yourself like you had the flu. So I did an Instacart order. I got lots of water. I ordered a mini fridge because I already was prepared to like hunker down in isolation. And so I got like things that I thought I would need, like electrolytes and, crackers, just stuff that would get me through. I mean, I wasn't really eating, but just kind of how you nurse yourself through the flu. And so I was about 5 days in, and one of the things that the doctors had told me was if your oxygen dips below a certain point or your fever gets too high and doesn't break, then you need to either come back to the emergency room or call an ambulance. And another part of that was like, if you find that you're having trouble breathing, then you need to also. So it was about 3:30 in the morning, Saturday night, the following Saturday. And it was about 3 o'clock in the morning and I couldn't breathe. I was really short in breath. So I took out my little pulse ox machine and I'm testing my oxygen. My oxygen was at 69. Your oxygen should be at 100%. My oxygen was at 69. They told me if it went below 80 that I needed to call or get to the hospital in some way. So I called the non-emergency line to the police dispatch. I told them what was happening. I said, because at this time, your family can't drive you to the hospital. I couldn't drive myself to the hospital. So I called the non-emergency line and I just told them, I have COVID. Here's my oxygen readings. I'm having shortness of breath. And the doctors told me to reach out. So 3:30 in the morning, they send a team full of firefighters. They send the ambulance. And I don't know if the police were here. I don't think they were. I think it was just the ambulance and the fire. And I'm sitting on my porch because I had to call my mom and tell her, hey, I had to call the ambulance. I need you to open the front door so that I'm not touching anything to get out to the front lawn to meet the ambulance. So she opens the door and she moves away, like, so I'm not near her. And I go and I sit on the porch and she's all watching this from inside the house. The paramedics roll up and they're asking me all kinds of questions. And all I can see is like 10 men on my front lawn. The paramedics are in PPE and the firemen are just kind of standing around. And I was like too sick to be mortified by the situation because I was just sick. Like, it didn't matter to me. I had no humility at that point. So they tested my oxygen as well, and they tested my fever, and they're like, we're going to take you in to the local hospital. So I ended up going by ambulance, and it wasn't like some urgent out of the movie sirens on. It wasn't like that. They just transported me. And so the local hospital had a COVID unit. It was at the top floor of the hospital. So the paramedics were able to drive up to the helipad. And so from the helipad is where they took me into the COVID unit. And so they had little like coves in the COVID unit. I guess it was like intake to determine what they were going to do with these patients. And I thought I was going to be going home like within 24 hours. Like, I thought, they'll do what they need to do and then I'm going to go back home. So they get me into this bed, and the first thing they do is to give you potassium because there was a worry that COVID had done something to the heart that was causing heart problems. And so immediately they give you a shot of potassium, which is the most painful shot if you've never had it. It is so painful when they give it to you, and you almost, because they had already IV'd me, but I thought it was like some continuous pump of medicine, but it wasn't. It was one shot, but the way it goes through your body is so painful. I was crying because it hurt so bad. And I kept asking the nurse, like, it's burning. Like, when is it going to stop burning? And she said, it'll stop burning. I'll tell the doctor, like, if it keeps burning. And so at that point, I'm in that room for, I want to say 4 or 5 hours. As sick as I was, I'm still an impatient person. Like, I want to know, like, if you're going to keep me, I just want to know that you're going to keep me. But the doctors and the nurses were keeping me in limbo. And I truly believe it's because at that time, they didn't know what to do with us. They didn't know what to do with COVID patients. And so they told me, you're going to be admitted. And all I had with me was my purse and my cell phone. Thank God I remembered a cell phone charger. So I called my mom and I said, I'm going to be admitted. And I was crying because I was scared. And, it just was scary for everybody. So I get wheeled into this room. It has this massive, I don't know if it was an air conditioner or an air purifier, but this massive air machine. I'm pretty sure it was an air purifier. And it's like half the size of a hospital room. It has one bed and then the bathroom. And that's it. Like, you're locked down in this COVID ward. You don't have roommates. The nurses barely come in to see you. And the doctors really don't come in to see you. So it could have been a good 8 or 9 hours, sometimes longer, before I saw a nurse or a doctor. And so timelines are a little blurry to me just because the first 3 days were really the worst of it. At some point, I took a nosedive with how sick I was. They could not stabilize my oxygen, so they put me on high flow. First, they tried the normal, like, nose oxygen. That didn't work. I'm covered in wires because they're monitoring my heart, but I'm still getting more sick. Like, they have me on an antibiotic infusion, but I'm not getting any better. And so I take a nosedive. I'm in constant contact with my best friend, and I'm still checking in at work, which I was very, very resentful about because I'm like in the hospital. And I'm just kind of in touch with my family. Like, I don't want to bother my family, but I also want them to kind of know what's going on. But then again, at some point, it did take a pretty drastic nosedive. I was transferred to the step down unit. So it's basically one like care level beneath the ICU. And so I remember the doctor talking to me because I had a really bad cough from my pneumonia. And I remember the doctor talking to me, and he says, we just don't know how to treat COVID. We just are kind of experimenting. And, he's telling me about the research that's being done with COVID. And like, I'm hearing it, but like, I can't believe this is happening. But I'm getting progressively more sick to where I was just out of it. Like, I went from being sick but conscious to being sick but like near unconscious. And there was a moment where, and it makes me emotional, but there was a moment when I was coughing really badly. And I had this lovely nurse, and I wish I would have remembered what her name was because I wanted to nominate her for a Daisy Award. But I had this wonderful nurse who came and she sat with me and she's like, lay on your stomach because that was the best treatment for the cough. And she rubbed my back, and I told her I'm scared that I'm going to die. And she just sat there rubbing my back, and she comforted me. And she didn't have to do that. Like, she didn't have to sit there and do that with me. But the humanity that she showed in that moment is something that I'll never forget. So I'm kind of like in and out of consciousness at this point. I'm sleeping for a lot of hours, 9 or 10 hours. There was one point where my friend couldn't get a hold of me. So she contacted my sister. My sister hadn't heard from me. She didn't know what to do. She's texting and calling me. She thought that I had died. And then eventually I messaged her back. I said, hey, I'm alive. I just was asleep. And so there just were a lot of people that were worried. I was the only person at that time who knew about like what was going on. I was the only person at that time that people knew who was going through this. So when I talked to my best friend, she had texted me and said, hey, I was talking to somebody at work whose mother-in-law was sick like you with COVID, and they gave her medication that really helped her and it saved her life. And so she's like, you should ask the doctor about it. And so I told the doctor, and I was talking to him about it, and he was like, well, the medication, which was called remdesivir, is experimental. Like, it hasn't been proven to treat COVID. He said, we can get that for you, but it has to be transported to this hospital because we don't have a supply of it. So again, I took another turn to where I was too sick to even make medical decisions for myself. Talking to me, and all I'm telling them is, you need to call my mom. Well, my mom told them to speak to my dad. And so my dad was making medical decisions for me. And I don't really know what those conversations were like. Obviously, we've never talked about them. I've never asked him about them. All they've told me is that you were really sick. And it was very scary because we didn't know, basically, we didn't know if you were going to die or not. And so ultimately, they were able to get the remdesivir transported to the hospital. It took about 24 hours, but in that 24 hours, I was dying. My oxygen levels had dipped. I was near unconscious. The doctors used a combination of remdesivir, which was the medication, and then they used plasma antibodies, which the combination of the two had shown in studies from COVID patients to exhibit a turnaround in healing. So I had to sign consent forms, even as sick as I was. I'm like scribbling my name on these consent forms. I didn't read them. I don't know what they said. Probably just said like, whatever the warnings are when you get kind of any infusion or blood transfusion or whatever. So within 24 hours of those conversations with my dad and then me signing those papers, I'm getting worse. Like I'm like actively dying in the step down unit. And the doctor's kind of wavering because he doesn't know if he's going to send me to the ICU. They're just praying that this medication gets here as fast as it can. So I'm asking the nurse, like when I am conscious, I'm asking the nurse, like, did you get the medicine? And ultimately, I don't know what the timeline was because I was just so out of it, but they did get the remdesivir and they did get the antibodies. And I went through, I think it was 4 plasma infusions. And then I don't know how many cycles of the remdesivir, like I don't know what the standard was. I could probably look at my notes from my medical papers, but I don't know. And then things started to turn around. Within 24 hours of me getting those infusions, I started to show improvements. And the doctor didn't have to move me to the ICU. I was still on very high flow oxygen. It was still very fatigued and I couldn't stand up. I was a fall risk. I wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom by myself. I had to use a commode next to my bed, and even getting out of my bed to use the commode, which is a toilet, took so much strength to do. Like it was so hard. And I had that one nice nurse, but every other nurse I had was terrible. And I understand. I had my 2 best friends, they're nurses, and COVID treated healthcare workers terribly. I get that. But when you're a patient on the other side and you don't have nurses that are coming in and being kind and exhibiting humanity, that makes your experience 100 times worse. And I just wanted to get the hell out of the hospital. As soon as I started to just even feel a little bit better, I mean, I was ready to like jump out the window. I wanted to go home. And I couldn't because there just was no way for me to go home with my oxygen level still being low and me still being on oxygen. And I was determined to go home. So I want to say it was still another 3 or 4 days before I was able to go home. I spent a total of 13 days in the step down unit at the hospital. And by day 10, I was like, no, I gotta go. The doctor needs to let me go home. Like, I don't want to be here anymore. You don't want me here. Like, I just don't want to be here. And I was fighting with the nurses. I am not a good patient. And there was this one nurse in particular who was younger than me. She was like probably a new grad nurse. And I'm making her life miserable because I'm like, well, the doctor said I could go home if my oxygen level was XYZ. And I said, it's almost there. And she said, but it's not there. I said, yeah, but it's almost there. And I was so mad at her. I probably looked like just a grumpy, bitchy toddler to her because I was just so determined to leave the hospital. And I was texting my friends. I was like, this nurse is trying to kill me. She wants me to die in this hospital. And I was just like so determined because I was going stir crazy and I was nervous and I didn't want to die in the hospital. And so ultimately, I did convince the doctors to let me go home. They didn't want to let me go home. They would have kept me another 10 days if they could have. But I was fighting with them. So as soon as my oxygen hit, I believe it was like 89 or 90, I was like, I'm going home. You're going to discharge me. And by whatever means, I was going to be able to get there. And so they're like, okay, we'll release you. You can go home. This is day 12. I'm talking to the doctor. He says, if you can get your oxygen stabilized at 90, like keep it there, we'll let you go home tomorrow. And so I was able to do that. And they were able to take me off high flow oxygen the day before. So I was just on normal oxygen. And it was different. If you've ever been on high flow oxygen, basically, if you've seen people in the hospital and they have those plugs up their nose that's giving them oxygen, it has like a steady flow. Like they're breathing in oxygen, but it's not like being forced into their body. High flow oxygen forces oxygen at a pressure rate into your nose so that you are forcing oxygen into your body. And peak COVID, not a lot of resources. There were hospitals that didn't have PPE. There were hospitals that didn't have beds. They didn't have oxygen. They didn't have respirators. I mean, this is peak first wave of COVID. And again, just like the nurses, there were times I didn't see a respiratory therapist for hours. And what happens with high flow oxygen is if you are not getting, to my understanding, if you're not getting the fluid refilled on the machine, then the high flow that's being pressurized and being put into your body is like freezing cold. And it was so uncomfortable because the nurses would scold me because I would want to take it out because it like burned. It was so cold. And then they'd be like, we called respiratory, they should be coming. And like, they weren't coming. And I was trying to rip the thing out of my nose and the nurse would get mad at me. And it was just like, all of it was just a nightmare, you know? And yes, I know it could have been worse. I know that it could have been a million times worse. But when you're in that situation, you're just like, get me the hell out of here. Like, I'm over this. I'm done with it. I don't want to be here. So I was able to go home. The doctor said, you can go home. You have to have oxygen in your home. I'm sending you home with an oxygen concentrator and 2 extra tanks of oxygen. He says, you cannot be off of oxygen. You have to have it wherever you go. But the caveat is that I was still not allowed to leave isolation in my house, not even out of my room. The only time I could leave my room was to go to the bathroom. And I spent, I think it was like another 45 days that I was just in my room. I couldn't even like leave the confines of my bedroom. And so being home, just in the comfort of your home, knowing that you're like better and you're not going to die from this situation, it was a relief. And then you go stir crazy from being home. So I got released from the hospital in early August. And by the mid of September, I was losing my mind. I was bored. I had no social interaction. And when I'll never forget, like the day I was just able to leave my room and just sit in the living room on the couch, it was just like, oh my God, like this is amazing. I had my little oxygen tank with me and like, it was just, I just felt so free. Like, and then I got stir crazy because I wasn't working, but I was really fatigued. Like I couldn't really be up for more than like 4 or 5 hours. And all I was doing was sleeping because COVID wipes your body out. Like it just takes everything you had. When I was able to take my first shower after COVID, it was so hard because I couldn't even lift my arms over my head. But I was so prideful that I didn't want the nurse at the hospital to help me. And so I was determined just to do things by myself, which in retrospect was probably really stupid because I could have fallen or fainted in the hospital bathroom. But the CNA was like, okay, like you can wash yourself, but I'm going to stand right here. Like, you know, and she gave me privacy, but she was still in the bathroom with me. And so like just the freedom after being that sick was just kind of liberating. And going back to thinking about being in the hospital, you're alone in this room. You're not getting interaction. Even the nurses and doctors are, like I said before, they're limiting their time that they're coming in and interacting with you. And so during the moments that were pretty pretty low. I remember being in my hospital bed and crying because I was scared. I was scared. This was before I took a nosedive, but I was scared that I was going to die. And I remember sitting there and I'm just asking, like, I'm praying. I'm just like, I need somebody to be with me. So, like, I'm calling out, and I'm a spiritual person. I'm not a cuckoo. Like, I'm not, singing Kumbaya with ghosts and stuff like that. Like, that's just not who I am. But I was praying and I said, and I was actually talking to my great grandma in like spirit, like, like you talk to God. And I'm just like, I just need somebody to sit with me. Like, I just need somebody with me. And I'm going to get emotional again. But my grandma didn't come. She said, no, I can't do that. But my Aunt Anna Marie, I believe 100% that my Aunt Anna Marie came and sat in that hospital room with me. And I can't explain it. I just felt her presence. I didn't see her, but I just felt her. And I fell asleep. I just almost felt like, I don't know if you've had these experiences, but like when your mom or your grandma, when you're little and they're like tucking you in bed and you just feel that like comfort of that figure of somebody who loves you and they're taking care of you. And it's just comfort. And I felt it. And I'll never forget that. And so coming home from the hospital, COVID was still crazy. There wasn't a vaccine. There just was still a lot of chaos. There were talks of a vaccine. And I got a lot of PTSD coming out from having COVID. When things started to be lifted for the restrictions, I still wouldn't leave my house. When I had my post-hospital release visit where they were taking x-rays of my lungs and I was meeting with the doctor, I went to the doctor's office in full PPE. I had a mask, I had a visor, I had gloves on. People looked at me like I was nuts, but I was terrified to get COVID again. And the most frustrating part of it was, after things died down and the vaccines came out, which I was thankfully one of the first people in line for the vaccine because of my being high risk from having such a severe case of COVID. And I have asthma, so that made me high risk as well. I was scared to leave my house. I remember sitting and talking to my mom and just crying and saying, I'm just scared to get COVID again. Like, I want to leave. Like, I want to do normal things, but I don't want to get sick again. And it's a feeling like I've never experienced before because you kind of go into panic and you just want to crawl up into a ball. And I can only imagine it almost feels like what an agoraphobic feels like, of not wanting to leave their home. Thankfully, progressively, I was able just to get back into things and I returned to work and life goes back to normal. But, with anything that comes about, there's always ignorant people and there's always ignorance that runs the world. And I remember talking to people about COVID and, they ask about your story and they find out you've been in the hospital and, you tell them, oh, well, I got the remdesivir and the plasma antibodies. Oh, well, that's not what saved your life. Oh, it's not? They said, well, maybe the antibodies did, but not the remdesivir. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure that you weren't dying in the hospital, but I wholeheartedly believe in the science that I think saved my life. And I'm sure that you would too if you were in that position. And so even as, 2020 rolled around, people were still dying. I had an aunt who passed away from COVID in January of 2021. And then I had a cousin who passed away, I believe it was later that year. And it was sad. Like, lost people from COVID. I wasn't close to those people, but it was still a sad thing to see. And just to be grateful that I wasn't one of those people, it really kind of puts into perspective how valuable your life is and that I'm here for a purpose. And I do remind myself of that when I'm having really hard times or going through bad things, and that my life could have easily been taken from me. And I could have just been another statistic. And so I do take it personal when people deny COVID. I take it personal when people say that it wasn't as big as an issue as it was, or that the science behind it didn't save lives. I think that, in my opinion, the medical experts were doing their best regarding a disease that they really didn't know much about. And it just makes me sad that we live in a world where there are so many uneducated, ignorant people who lack human empathy and basic humanity. And you found that in people that died of COVID, where their families were still COVID deniers. And I would get so upset with my family when they wouldn't get the vaccine, to ultimately, you throw your hands up and you say, hey, do what you need to do for yourself. I'm still going to be vaccinated. I'm going to make the best decision for myself. You don't have to do that, but I'm going to protect myself. But that doesn't frustrate me as much as the people who denied and try to make people like me sound stupid or discount my experience because I survived it. Like, it's something that I went through, I lived through, and I'm very thankful for it, but it doesn't belittle the experience that I had of dying. I was actively dying, and that's a scary place to be. And I have a lot of compassion for people that go through things like cancer and, other terminal illnesses. I only had a taste of it. And I don't know what it feels like to be in those situations, but I can empathize for how difficult it is for people going through that. And it makes me sad that there are so many people in this world, specifically in the United States, who have the mentality of like, they don't love their neighbor, And so I just think it's important in today's climate to remember that we're all human, and what happened to me could happen to you with something else. Your life could be taken in an instant. You could get a life-threatening illness and die tomorrow. You could get cancer and die in 3 months. You could get cancer and live through it. You could still get COVID and die from it. And I just wish people had more compassion and the world was a little bit more humane when dealing with others. I think that we live in idiocracy right now. And I think that too many people have their head up their ass. I think that I understand people are tired and I understand that people want changes, but it also is disheartening when people don't even trust science or medicine anymore. And frankly, that scares me. So I just want people to open their eyes to that this could happen again. We could go through another pandemic. We could encounter another event that is life-altering for all of us. And put yourself in the shoes of people that have had these experiences, that are going through things that are putting their lives at risk now, whether it's COVID, cancer, some other illness, but that these things pick people at random. There's no lottery system. There's nothing to say that you're not going to get cancer. I know healthy people who've had cancer. I know not healthy people who've had cancer. I know young people who've had cancer and terminal illnesses. I know people who have lived through them and fought through them and survived. And I know people who haven't, not just cancer, but diseases. And I just encourage people to, yes, do their own research, but also be objective to that. There's a reason why we have science and medicine and people that are certified and educated in things like pandemics and disease control and diseases. And there's doctors that are smart and they know what they're saying. And there's doctors that are smart and can tell you, look, we don't know, but these are the best guidelines that we can put forward. And to not criticize and bash them because they got into their industry to help people. And I just wanted to share my story and kind of give a little bit of why I stand where I stand in today's world, and, give my blessings to people who may be going through something that's hurting them or they're dealing with and suffering from. And I'm thankful to the people that were there for me through my experience. I'm thankful to all the people who prayed for me because I had a lot of people praying for me. I'm not a religious person. I consider myself agnostic. I'm spiritual. You're not going to find me in church unless it's a holiday. But I do know for a fact that I had a lot of people praying for me. And I was on a lot of prayer lists. And so I am grateful for the people that thought about me and had me in their prayers. And who's not to say that that didn't have anything to do with why I pulled through? It could have, it could not have. But I am thankful for the human compassion that I was shown through my experience. And that's why I extend it to other people when I hear about their stories, or it's somebody that I know and love who is going through something that's hurting them. So I just encourage people to be compassionate and have some humanity. And I think that hopefully we'll get through whatever life throws at us in the next, I don't know how many years. But thank you for listening. If you want to continue to hear my podcasts, go ahead and subscribe. You can find me on Spotify or anywhere you stream podcasts. Make sure to like my podcast. You can rate it and leave me a little review. You can also find me on all social media platforms. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky Social. Thanks for listening.